Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the 126th Landon Lecture on Public Affairs. The Landon Lectures were begun in 1966 by the late Governor Alf Landon and the late K-State President James McCain. The goal of the Landon Lectures is to bring the most prominent public figures to Kansas State University to discuss the pressing issues of the day. We are very pleased today to welcome Secretary of the Interior, Gale A. Norton, to the Landon podium to join 125 predecessors in bringing their thoughts and opinions on important public issues. Before introducing Secretary Norton and introducing other members of the platform party, we're very pleased that 3 members of the Kansas State Senate would be able to attend this lecture today. First, I'd like to introduce the majority leader of the Kansas State Senate, our own fine and excellent Senator Lana Olane. Lana? And Senator Mark Tadigan was scheduled to come because of the wind damage and so forth last night. He was not able to make it. But we are also joined by Senator Bob Tyson. Bob? Senator Janice Lee. And I can see that we have one of my bosses out here and a member of the 9-person member Kansas Board of Regents, Jack Wempe. Jack, thank you for coming today. Well, let me introduce the other members of the platform party. On my left, Dr. C. Sheldon, Professor of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work, and President of the Kansas State University Faculty Senate. Next to Sia is Zach Cook, a senior in Biological and Agricultural Engineering, and the Student Body President for K-State. Zach? On my right, Dr. Charles Reagan, Associate to the President and Chairman of the Landon Lecture Series. Unable to make it today because he's out of town, Edward Seaton, Chairman of the Landon Patrons and publisher of the Manhattan Mercury. He was not able to join us. Well, Gale Norton is the 48th Secretary of the United States Department of the Interior and the first woman to hold and head this 151-year-old federal agency. Her 20-year career in public service is characterized by a common thread of bringing people of goodwill together to find solutions to public problems. She served as the Attorney General of Colorado from 1991 to 1999. She has argued cases before the U.S. Supreme Court and other appellate courts and testified numerous times before congressional committees. As Attorney General of Colorado, she litigated state and federal constitutional issues, defended the state against federal mandates, and won a major court victory in pressuring the federal government to adequately clean up hazardous waste at Rocky Flats and the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. Secretary Norton also served as the chair of the Environment Committee for the National Association of Attorneys General. She was also one of the negotiators at the $206 billion National Tobacco Settlement. During her career as an attorney and as the Attorney General of Colorado, she has received many awards and honors. Among these is the prestigious Colorado Women's Bar Association's highest honor, the Mary Latrop Trailblazer Award. Prior to her election as Attorney General, Ms. Norton served in Washington as Associate Solicitor of the U.S. Department of the Interior, overseeing the endangered species and public lands legal issues for the National Park Service. She also spent some time as assistant to the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture. Secretary Norton graduated magna cum laude from the University of Denver and earned her law degree with honors from the University of Denver as well. She was a National Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, where she conducted research on innovative ways to control air pollution. She and her husband are avid hikers and outdoor enthusiasts. Please help me welcome Gale Norton, the United States Secretary of the Interior, to the Landon podium.
Thank you. It's great to see all of you here today and to have the opportunity to talk about some issues that are very important to me. I know that I'm following most recently as one of your speakers, J.C. Watts. That's a tough act to follow, but I'll try to do my best. I've had a great weekend here in Kansas. We just had a wonderful ceremony at the Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. It received the designation of a Ramsar wetland site, which is a significance that it has the significance that it is a wetland of international importance. And so this is a tremendous recognition. There are only 18 such sites in the United States. So we had a wonderful opportunity to see that area. Well, I was born here in Kansas, and so it's great to have the opportunity to come back to the place where I was born. I lived in Wichita for the first 5 years of my life. My family lived about half a block away from the Little Arkansas River. Ever since then, people have kind of teased me about the pronunciation of that, but I know that the right pronunciation is Arkansas. It was here that I began my interest in nature. We had the river itself, the tornadoes, the beautiful places that we would drive to see. I remember when we kids got together and decided to create a museum, like a natural history museum. We had a few interesting rocks, some pretty leaves. The star of our show was a dead frog that had been run over by a car. Well, somehow that was never quite the moneymaker that our lemonade stand was. But that was something that sparked my interest. My parents are here today visiting. They live in Wichita now again, and they have been so terrific to me and so supportive. Whenever you see a woman who is the first something or another, I think very often behind that woman are parents who encouraged her and said, "You can do it." And that certainly is the way that my parents are. And I would ask them to stand, but I promised that I wouldn't embarrass them by doing that. But they are here watching today. Well, Kansas and nature are irrevocably tied together in my mind. That and the flat frog. The first settlers in Kansas must have felt in awe of nature here as they came upon thousands and thousands of acres of tallgrass prairie across the state. At one time, there were 142 million acres of this prairie stretching across the middle of the United States. The grasses of the prairie, like big blue stem, could grow as tall as a man, and they supported an abundant ecosystem. The tallgrass prairie had a role in the romantic vision of the cowboy life. The cattle were driven up from Texas. They grazed along the way. The cowboys lived on horseback, listened to the cattle lowing and the guitar playing, and watched the spectacular night sky unimpeded by trees. Droughts came and went. Fires regularly burned the area, and bison trampled through the tall grass, but the prairie survived. The prairie plants found ways to outlive each circumstance. Fires that can be devastating to a mature forest work on the prairie as if they were told to perform the jobs of raking and mowing and fertilizing. The Indians noted that the recovering prairie seemed even greener after a fire. What the tallgrass prairie could not survive was man and his plow. The prairie did not yield easily to the plow, but man is a persistent creature. And when he had succeeded, he was rewarded with rich topsoil that could be conquered with irrigation, fences, wheat and corn plants. The deep organic soils formed by the cyclic degradation of prairie roots left a rich legacy to modern agriculture. Today, Kansas farmers can feed millions. The tallgrass prairie is the most altered ecological community in North America. After surviving for 9,000 years since the last ice age, the prairie was nearly all plowed under in less than a century. Today, less than 5% survives. The good news is that Kansas has 80% of what is left, and most of it is in the Flint Hills. Since the prairie here is underlain with rock, the soil is too thin often for the plow. There are about 4 million acres of tallgrass prairie in Kansas, Oklahoma, and a little in Missouri. And most of that tallgrass prairie is in the hands of private owners. In the 1960s and 1970s, as many of you here know, there were government efforts to preserve that prairie. And for the most part, the Kansas Grassroots Association said, no thank you. We don't want to have government ownership of the prairie. In the late 1990s, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks again began talking about how to preserve the prairie. They talked with the Nature Conservancy about how to do it. The small group soon determined that they weren't going to make much headway unless they began involving the ranchers. I'm proud of the efforts of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service employee Jim Minerath. He had the diplomatic skills to approach the Kansas Livestock Association to ask them for the names of ranchers who might be willing to work with conservationists. Mike Beam of the Kansas Livestock Association said, "It is fair to say that the government, the Nature Conservancy, and the Kansas Livestock Association were not natural soulmates. They had to be pragmatic and include stakeholders." I hear some laughter there. They had to be pragmatic and include stakeholders from the environmental and ranching communities to form partnerships and get things done. From this beginning began the Tallgrass Prairie Alliance, the Tallgrass Legacy Alliance. Its purpose is to conserve and enhance the biotic, economic, and cultural integrity of the Tallgrass Prairie. And the member organizations now include the Kansas Livestock Association, Kansas Farm Bureau, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, Wildlife Management Institute, Nature Conservancy, my own U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the State Conservation Commission, and the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. I know that scientists from KSU also play a part in those efforts. Rancher Tom Moxley is the chairman of the Tallgrass Legacy Alliance, and coincidentally, his wife Virginia is an associate dean here at KSU. Tom says that there are opposite poles among the members, but they find they have a lot more in common than one might think. He said, "Farmers and ranchers are the original environmentalists. We, more than anyone else, want to preserve the tall grass for generations to follow." Well, we've seen that this type of opportunity can happen across the country. We're seeing farmers and ranchers and environmentalists come together to begin using conservation easements, to begin working together on adjusting farmland practices to the needs of the natural environment. Here on the Tallgrass Prairie, the cattle grazing is being used to mimic the grazing of the bison, so that the prairie ecosystem remains intact. I agree that this approach, as shown through the leadership of Kansas livestock leaders and environmentalists, is a poster child for how the federal government, and especially the Department of the Interior, should operate across the country. It's part of something that I call the 4 C's: communication, cooperation, and consultation, all in the service of conservation. This is an approach that we call overall a new environmentalism. I'd like to trace with you some of the historic roots of that and what our approach means. This new era of conservation will usher in a new environmentalism. At Interior, I've hired someone that is known to many of you, Steve Williams, the former director of the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, to be the director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Steve had his hand in the Tallgrass Legacy Alliance. He understands the need for pragmatism and partnerships, and he is the type of person that I want on my team. Steve has already applied the 4 C's successfully in Kansas on other projects as well. He was a driving force in restoring the McPherson Valley Wetlands Complex in central Kansas, working with Ducks Unlimited, Fish and Wildlife, the Nature Conservancy, and the Koch Pipeline Company. These successes are models that can have nationwide repercussions. Their importance can be understood only by looking at their historic and environmental significance. We've come through two great eras in the environmental and conservation movement. The first of those was typified by Teddy Roosevelt, an avid outdoorsman and hunter who saw that the populations of wildlife were beginning to decline. He put the weight of his presidency behind conserving public lands and wildlife, establishing the National Wildlife Refuge System and the U.S. Forest Service, and designating 18 areas of public lands as parks and monuments. For the first few decades, the conservation movement focused on setting aside parks and wildlife refuges, both at the federal and state level, and the management of game species such as waterfowl and deer. Over time, the conservation ethic evolved and expanded. By the late 1940s, Aldo Leopold, a forester by training, was calling for a more ambitious conservation agenda. He published the Sand County Almanac, which provided the framework for a new approach to natural resource management, one based on managing our lands as a whole rather than as individual parts. Leopold is now widely considered to be the founder of the field of conservation ecology. In my mind, he also laid the groundwork for a modern holistic approach to conservation and environmental protection. At the heart of his conservation ethic was a call to all citizens to take responsibility and become stewards of the land. As a college student, I read Leopold's work. It helped shape my philosophy about the role of individuals in caring for our lands. The history of the environmental movement over the last 35 years of the 20th century lacked the philosophical optimism of the earlier environmental era. The environmental problems were perhaps more dramatically visible. The American symbol, the bald eagle, on the verge of extinction, the Cuyahoga River on fire, smokestacks belching pollution in our cities. Rachel Carson captured the spirit of those times with her 1962 book, Silent Spring, that talked about the consequences of industrial development. Out of this crisis period came the enactment of landmark environmental laws like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. Each of these focused on environmental protection through law enforcement and punishment. Compliance with these laws and others has significantly improved our environment. Many may not realize how much improvement we've seen because it has all occurred so gradually. In 1972, only a third of the nation's rivers were safe for fishing and swimming. By the 1980s, more than half of the rivers were considered safe. And today we view clean rivers as the norm. Motor vehicle improvements have led to a reduction, for example, in lead emissions from 200 million tons in 1970 to about 4 million tons today. These successes have not been without controversy along the way. Federal policies resulted in conflicts, both real and perceived, between economic growth and environmental protection. Environmental discussions triggered passionate antagonism. In political and media debates, environmentalists and businesses demonized each other. Environmental protection and economic growth were seen as mutually exclusive. My own experiences were shaped by those larger societal trends. In the 1960s and 1970s, I lived in Thornton, Colorado, and every morning I would come over the hill on a school bus and see the whole Denver Valley below me. When I was in elementary school, I could see downtown Denver clearly, but as I grew older, the city disappeared behind a blanket of smog. And I became active in environmental groups and was involved throughout high school and college in a number of different environmental activities. As a young attorney, I began representing farmers and ranchers, small businesses, and others who were frequently confused by government regulation. I began to see that they had their own dreams, their own desire to live their lives, and found government regulation as a distant and heavy-handed bureaucracy standing in the way. Since I retained my own desire to protect the environment, yet sympathized with their plight, I sought ways to protect environmental values without trampling on other important values, like individual freedom and the basic need to make a living. I became interested in economic incentive approaches to pollution control. In the early 1980s, I spent a year at the Hoover Institution at Stanford researching emissions trading as one of those innovative methods. Later, I did policy analysis for the Council on Environmental Quality on enhancing wetlands using economic incentives. I avidly read and discussed the work of others who were pursuing non-coercive, market-based ways of achieving positive environmental results. Environmental issues today are much more complex and subtle than they were in the 1960s and 1970s. We face issues like non-point source pollution and global climate change that don't lend themselves to simple solutions. In the land conservation category, the growth of our population and the expansion of our economy has increased pressures correspondingly on our undeveloped land, water resources, and wildlife habitat. With this backdrop, we're setting the stage for a new environmentalism. We've come to realize that we must work in partnership with people who farm, ranch, log, and build on private land. While countless species depend on the land to sustain life, families depend on the land for economic survival. The Tallgrass Legacy Alliance is a perfect example of this. I believe that most Americans, especially those who depend on the land for their livelihood, are ready and willing to step up to the challenge. In this new environmentalism, we must embrace the goal of finding ways to have both a thriving economy and a spectacular natural environment. We can develop more energy resources that are renewable, such as solar, wind, biomass, and geothermal energy on public lands. We can use 21st century technologies to develop traditional energy sources in environmentally sensitive ways. We can empower a new generation of citizen stewards who want to do the right thing, not because the law tells them to, but because they love the land and want to conserve it for their children. Rather than dictate from Washington how the land must be used, we need to work with people to determine how utilizing the land can be compatible with conservation. Americans are resourceful. We need to tap our own creativity and ingenuity. At Interior, we're also working with states to amplify our ability to protect our resources. I've made state and local government communication one of the performance goals of senior executives. We've rejuvenated working relationships with state regulators, wildlife agencies, governors, and parks directors. Several of our budget proposals have been structured to empower states to resolve environmental controversies. New environmentalism captures Aldo Leopold's vision of a nation of citizen conservationists. Successful conservation can be a partnership between government and citizens. The government's role is to empower the people to take conservation into their own hands. The mandates of the Endangered Species Act serve as one example of ways in which we can have a positive change. We are working on ways to have cooperative approaches that will truly recover endangered species. Jim Bill Anderson is typical of the citizen conservationists we hope to empower with the new environmentalism. He grazes cattle on a 49,000-acre ranch near the Canadian River in Texas. Like many ranchers, Anderson has a deep love and knowledge of the land and its wildlife. He wants to make a living, and he wants to conserve the land for future generations. Over the last decade, Anderson voluntarily has paid to fence off environmentally sensitive areas of his ranch. Last year, he split the cost of finishing the project with the Fish and Wildlife Service. The fencing has made his land both more productive for cattle, but also for wildlife, including the lesser prairie chicken, which is a candidate for listing under the endangered species. Another Texas landowner recently summed up the sentiments of the partners who work with us on these conservation projects. He told my science advisor, "Thank you for empowering us to help ourselves." President Bush has pushed to further empower these types of habitat enhancement projects through two programs called the Landowner Incentive Program and the Private Stewardship Grant Program. Both of these together will allow the federal government to pay for projects that will conserve habitat on private land while working closely with the landowners. We hope that the end result will be that landowners will embrace endangered and threatened species instead of trying to force them off their land before the regulatory issues become apparent. This is the path to a new environmentalism, a path away from conflict and toward consensus and partnership. To move us further along this path, I recommended, and the President agreed, to propose something in the fiscal year 2003 budget called the Co-Operative Conservation Initiative. This is a very ambitious goal. It will help remove barriers to citizen participation in environmentalism. The President is proposing $100 million in challenge grants to landowners, land user groups, conservation groups, and local and state governments for conservation projects that enhance the health of the land. This is the carrot instead of the stick, incentive instead of punishment. Half the new money, or $50 million, will be invested with states to fund cost-share grants for innovative conservation projects. This will allow states to work with their communities to come up with solutions. The other half will be divided among the National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Bureau of Land Management. Our local land managers will be able to apply for these challenge grants if they can recruit local conservation groups, local agriculture groups, local service clubs to work with them and provide some of the funding for various projects. With new environmentalism, we will continue to find consensus and common ground. As the next generation of Americans become involved, we will have a healthier land, watched over by self-motivated citizen stewards. We will spend more time tending the land and less time jousting with sound bites and hyperbole. We are a nation founded on the principle that we can and must work together. We saw this in the aftermath of September 11th, in the long lines at blood banks, and the millions of dollars donated to victims and their families. We must apply the same sense of commitment to develop new environmentalism, ensuring our children and grandchildren inherit a nation that is as beautiful and strong as the one that we inherited. General Patton once said, "Never tell people how to do things. Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity." If we challenge the American people, we will create a new generation of citizen conservationists, people who know the land, love the land, and take care of the land in the greatest tradition of our nation. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Gale. That was great. Gale, that was an excellent address, and as you know out here, we now have an opportunity for questions and answers, and we have microphones set up on your left and on your right. So for those of you who would like to ask questions, would you please proceed to the mic? Do we have somebody over there? Please.
Thank you very much for speaking at our school, and just to let you know, this speech was a lot better than J.C. Watt's. But anyway, recently there have been some reports and letters coming out of government agencies that seem to undermine the President's position in public land use. Two examples would be an Interior Department report last March, which stated that wildlife face substantial risk if oil was developed in ANWR. Then just last week, there was the EPA report that supports the ban on snowmobiles in Yellowstone. So my question is, does there exist bipolar philosophical differences on public land use between those that serve at the pleasure of the president and the civil servants?
That question has several different parts to it. Let me start, first of all, with talking about the relationship of science to decision-making in our department. Because science needs to be the bedrock of our decisions, and we've had to make some tough calls on the basis of what the scientists tell us. And so if the science tells us something, then we move in that direction. The issue that you first mentioned about the study of wildlife at ANWR was one where our scientists in the U.S. Geological Survey spent years and years coming up with a computer model to predict the effects of energy development on wildlife. And they had one report that was released that had 5 different scenarios. Now, of those scenarios, one would have a substantial impact, but most of those would not have had a significant impact, little or no impact. And what we asked them to do was look at the most likely scenarios for development, the ones that were actually being talked about by Congress. So the one that had the most impact was one that was a level of development far above anything that is currently under discussion. And so when we asked them to plug in the new scenarios, they ran that computer program and came back with the result that there would be little or no effect on the caribou populations of the energy exploration and development in ANWR. The other issue is on snowmobiles. And that is one that has been quite interesting for us because we've talked about trying to get the local community together with our park superintendents to work with the snowmobile manufacturers on trying to use cleaner snowmobiles and trying to encourage a movement in that direction. And it was an example of what we see often in our decision making of either or. One side said either you have to have snowmobiles essentially totally unregulated and coming through with no restrictions, or you have to have no snowmobiles at all. And we said we think there's a middle ground. We want to see what can be done. So we've already imposed more speed limits, more requirements that the snowmobiles follow the rules. We have put in place a permit system so that people are not basically revving their engines waiting in line to get access to the park. And we're going to be working harder to see that the new generation of snowmobiles, which is much cleaner and less polluting, is what is used in Yellowstone. And the snowmobiles are confined to what are otherwise the paved roadways in the summer, so they can't go off onto other areas of the parks. And with those restrictions, we're still studying, but we think there are ways of trying to reconcile both the recreational use and the protection of the Yellowstone Park. All right.
Well, Gale, you gave a really interesting summary of the Tallgrass Prairie and its history, and we definitely have a great tradition of having the prairie in our backyard. We've got the Konza Prairie located just out of town, and it's a wonderful place to go and hike around in. It's got some great trails, and it's a privately owned and I think publicly managed property. We have also south of us a new Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, which to my knowledge is about 30,000 acres. It's quite extensive. I'm somewhat disenchanted when I go there though, and I can only hike on 122 acres of it because the remainder of it is leased to a private rancher. And I'm curious about what your reaction to that is, and your reaction to me being able to hike, say, over about 1,500 acres at the Konza, and what impact that has on even, say, the private use of snowmobiles in Yellowstone.
I'll be happy to ask the managers there about what the rationale is. We are trying to balance recreational use and human use of our lands with the main purpose for the protection. We have, within the Department of the Interior, first of all, it's important to remember we have over 1 out of every 5 acres of land in the entire country that are within my department. And so that is a huge variety of different types of land. And so we have some areas that are set aside as national recreation areas. We have some areas that are wilderness areas that are not for any motorized kinds of use. And we have some areas that are endangered species habitat, for example, where human, even hiking through an area, can disturb nesting birds or have other impacts. And so we need to essentially keep people out of some of our areas. And so there are ways of trying to balance things, and so we can ask about what the approach is here. Those decisions on how the areas are managed come in part from the guidelines that were put on by Congress. It's frequently Congress that establishes special designations, so we look to those. We also go through a local planning process that fills in the details of how we manage, and it would be through that local planning process that areas are set aside either for public access or for restrictions.
Okay, why don't we go ahead, please?
My name is Dusty Becker, and I'm a professor here, and I actually teach natural resources management, so I don't envy your position as being the person out there actually making resource management happen at the highest level in our nation. I am concerned, though, as a person who has studied this for probably about the same amount of time as you have, that when we try to balance our commitments to our public lands and our natural resources, especially some of those creatures and places that don't really have a voice and whose voice, when represented, is often considered to be represented by a fringe portion of our society. I worry about how those balances can ever tip in favor of those species. And I ask you, how do we actually defend the sacred? And when I say sacred, I mean these values that we espouse as children and descendants of pioneers. And we talk about our wilderness areas, and we talk about our diverse wildlife that exists nowhere else in the world. And yet, if we really truly step up to defend those, we're often cast aside as rabid environmentalists or unbalanced citizens and non-patriotic. It becomes quite a battle to be a good citizen and to really defend these resources. I fully appreciate the struggle of balancing, but if we continue to balance with favoring mining interests or industrial interests, stakeholders that want to exploit, and we always give them a place at the table and actually give them a portion of the resources, those resources and the quality of wilderness, the quality for wildlife diminishes with every decision. And so I ask you, when do you really step up for the sacred and embrace the John Muir ethics of preservation versus conservation in an age where we're running out of these precious sacred resources and where things are getting squeezed smaller and smaller? I know it's not a hard, I don't have the solution, and I do believe that your approach, local stakeholders, the problem with local stakeholders, and this comes from my personal research experience, is that oftentimes they don't have values at a larger level. They can only value their survival needs. And yes, people have a right to survive, and yet don't also we have a right to know that our wildlife will be there for our grandchildren in the future.
Okay. I think, first of all, again, we have to look at the broad diversity of different types of land and wildlife challenges that we face. First of all, we have wilderness areas, and I don't know the number of acres of wilderness, but in Alaska alone, we have wilderness areas totaling larger than the entire size of the state of California. And across the lower 48, we have set aside many areas as wilderness. And those are very often the areas that we view as the most sacred, the ones that are not subject to development pressures. No one is proposing development of any type in the wilderness areas. We have other areas like our national parks, and once again, there are pressures on those because it is largely the pressure of so many people wanting to come and see and enjoy them. But those areas, again, are ones that we view the non-impairment for future generations as being the highest value. If you look, on the other hand, look at it from the perspective of the extractive use of resources. Our mining has declined tremendously in this country. There is almost no new mining taking place in the United States. There are very few, but it's very rare. The oil and gas production is declining, and we rely more and more on foreign resources because we are producing less in this country as our demand increases. We are seeing with logging, for example, that in this country we log a very small fraction of what we used to do. And so, in essence, over the last 30 years, we've seen a switch so that it really is much more in favor now of the environmental approaches to things. But I think the future course of action is trying to find ways of balancing those things that require tapping into the knowledge that people have of their local communities and of the areas of public lands that are around them. So that instead, we set aside some areas and say, it's all or nothing. In this wilderness area, we are doing nothing. We are not having any impact. In other areas where we are going to use those, we want to find ways of minimizing the impact. We want to find ways of protecting our environment, using the highest tech approaches, using the cleanest approaches, using alternative fuels and finding new ways of having 21st century technology applied to environmental protection. And we can do those things so that we can have that sort of balance. And one point that you mentioned, I think it bothers me, and that is the idea that some people should be excluded from sitting down at the table. I think you only find the best solutions when you get people to sit down together and to have the give and take. And very often you find common ground. If you got, thank you. If you got, the previous example about the preserve, if we got perhaps the ranchers to sit down with the hikers and with the biologists and say, all right, what areas might we have available for hiking that would have the least impact on the prairie and on the ecosystem and on the species that are there? And what areas should we keep available just for the natural use? Getting that kind of discussion going allows people to understand each other and allows us to learn from each other about how we can best have terrific environmental protection. At the same time, we are going forward with creating jobs and giving people the opportunity to earn a living.
Very much. I guess if I could just say one slight more thing, that the problem with a middle ground like that is that while it sounds very balanced, It means that grizzly bears aren't at the table. It means that oil wells are put around our national parks. It means that snowmobiles are riding through the national parks. So I think there really has to be a balance in the favor of nature and not just in the favor of human choices and human stakeholders. Thank you.
Okay, next question. Please.
Thank you. I'll keep this short. I understand we're short on time. But I'm curious, Ms. Norton, that as you come here to Kansas and you do what great speakers do, you refer to local issues and local ideas and local things, how you feel that you can point to Kansas as an example of the forefront of the environmental movement. Because I know, having been involved in the aquatic ecosystems of Kansas, rivers and streams, that we are consistently ranked near the bottom of the nation in water quality. In a number of places throughout Kansas, there are fish advisories still in effect because of the insecticide chlordane, telling people that they should eat no more than 1 5-ounce meal of fish per month. Not just pregnant and nursing women, but all people. In fact, Kansas has very little federal land, the province of your department. Most of our federal land is either in military bases, Fort Leavenworth and Fort Riley near here, or in the Cimarron National Grasslands in southwest Kansas, originally purchased to prevent wind erosion from row crop production, which is so much an embarrassment to me that I refuse to take my friends from out of state to visit this national land because of its extensive oil and gas and cattle production. These kinds of uses, these kinds of private uses, have consistently put Kansas at the bottom of water quality. In fact, most of our streams, unlike the rest of the nation, are not fishable, swimmable, drinkable. And it has taken a lawsuit by the Sierra Club to get Kansas to enact laws and enforce laws that will protect these kinds of resources. So what I'm curious about is how you can come here and try and convince me that somehow Kansas should be a role model for the rest of the nation when our own environmental conditions here are, in many cases, so abominable.
Well, I think you might find some other people in this audience who would feel differently about that. I applaud those things that are being done well. No state does things perfectly. And coming to talk about the things that are models for things that are done well doesn't necessarily mean that we're saying everything is being done perfectly. I think you need to look and think about how you move Kansas from where it is today to the vision that you want to see of the future. Do you want my department to buy the state of Kansas? Obviously not. Do you want to have an approach that is going to alienate everyone in the state and to say that agriculture is going to come to a halt? I don't believe so. By having ways of trying to protect both the Kansas way of life and the wonderful agricultural legacy here, as well as protect the water quality, requires that people spend a lot of time working together and planning together. And I think the challenge for your generation, for the students here, is to take your drive to protect the environment, and instead of saying, so we need to stop agriculture, we need to stop industry, to find ways of having agriculture and industry in an environmentally responsible way. That's the real challenge for the future.
I would agree with what you said, that is the real challenge for the future, and I want to focus on the specific issue of pollution credits, which I think is a really good way to limit the current outputs of pollution to the levels you want them to be at. But I also think in the long term, there's a danger in having pollution credits as an asset that you put on your balance sheet and you think of it as something to expend. And I would hesitate to put a value on the future use of the land and the possible effects on health for people that don't really have a say other than their vote, their ability, their participation in government. They have a limited ability to affect the way pollution enters their environment and their bodies. So I would advocate weaning corporations off pollution credits and encouraging them to develop processes that don't even need those pollution credits.
Let me explain to you quickly how pollution credits work. Basically, they are a mechanism, and they give an incentive for everybody in every different factory and every different facility to find ways to prevent pollution and to minimize their emissions, to adopt the newest technologies, to find pollution prevention mechanisms that are going to work. And basically, they give everybody the incentive to be thinking creatively themselves about how to prevent pollution. The other approach is to come in and mandate technology. Say basically, everybody has to adopt this type of pollution control technology. You must install this piece of equipment in your factory. Well, everybody will dutifully install that piece of equipment, and they'll stop there. Instead, we'd like to see everybody thinking about ways to improve that. And from an economic perspective and a regulatory perspective, the pollution credit or emissions trading or cap and trade program, whatever you call it, is the best approach that we've found for capturing the invisible hand of Adam Smith to work on ways of protecting the environment. And that's a tool. The actual level of pollution is something that can then be set from a regulatory perspective. And in essence, if it were a true market system, the government can come in and buy off those pollution credits, retire them, so that that pollution is no longer legally available. So you can decrease the amount of pollution, but do so in a way that is the most innovative and creative approach to it. So it has a long-term benefit.
Well, we only have time for one more question, so.
Could I just wrap up real quickly?
One more question.
I just wondered, is the government currently buying more and more of those pollution credits and taking them off the market? Is that something that is in the plan right now?
At this point, we're still at the beginning end of that, and we're just getting those mechanisms in place. For example, the Clear Skies program that President Bush has recently proposed would apply that kind of an approach to 3 of the major pollutants that come from power plants. And so we're just at the beginning stages of getting that kind of a system set up and moving away from the install this type of technology regulation.
Thank you.
Okay, just one more question and we.
I'd just like to get your thoughts fast on how are ways that you could maybe create economic incentives to protect the environment without the use of direct federal subsidies. Because in my mind, with the direct subsidy, you kind of have 2 problems. First, you open the door for lobbyists and others to maybe dictate the flow of dollars. And the second problem is that the subsidies are usually targeted just at the point source pollution. And as you've mentioned today, some of the problems that we're currently facing are spread far wider than that. If I could just get your thoughts and maybe innovative ways or ideas you have to address that.
That's a good question, and frankly, the use of subsidies is something that is troubling because essentially you're making a permanent government role in these types of behavior. What we would like to do is to see long-term partnerships established on the land management side so that when the local environmental group and the local farmer and rancher sit down together, they learn that they do have things in common, and so they can establish that working relationship to solve problems as they come up in the future. On the more pollution-oriented side of that, again, there are incentives in the marketplace in terms of trying to cut the costs of production. And as we develop the technologies, whether it's agriculture or heavy industry or high-tech companies. As you develop the technologies that allow you to protect the environment at the lower cost, the government involvement can gradually fade away, and just the economics of doing business will encourage that lower cost. One thing that is very clear, and it has been true for the last 3 or 4 decades, is that the American public has developed a real value on environmental protection. And so there is an incentive for people in the business world to want to meet that value, and I think that will continue.
Okay, thanks a lot, and thank you again for visiting with us.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending this lecture today by the Secretary of the Interior, Gale Norton. Thank you very much for coming. We'll see you later.